Welcome everyone to MACFEST 2023. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Assalamu alaikum from France. Please tell us where you're joining us from. We're halfway through Ramadan, so Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak to all of you who are fasting still today. My name is Katarzyna, I'm a member of the MACFEST team. I'm joining you from France. The rest of our team is sitting in Manchester, and we're delighted to have such an international, broad audience today. Please tell us in the chat where you're joining us from. Today we have a wonderful event, Eat Like a Sultan, with Professor Daniel Newman. And our host for today is Karen Shannon. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Manchester Histories, one of our partners. So we're delighted to host Karen again this year. Let me introduce her first. Karen is an award-winning and passionate cultural leader with over 25 experience of working with the arts and cultural sector. She has led large-scale programs of work such as Let's Go Global, a community TV station supporting local people to make their own digital content. Looping the Loop, which launched the 2012 Northwest Cultural Olympiad, and the Peterloo 2019 program, which commemorated the significant moment of the history of Manchester. Since 2017, Karen has been the Chief Executive Officer of Manchester Histories, working with people, communities, partners, and artists to explore and share greater Manchester's past and to create a fairer future for all. Karen is an honorary research fellow at the University of Manchester and works alongside academics to deliver informed public engagement programs and the Manchester Histories Festival. So please share your comments, share your thoughts in the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from. If you have any questions, please put them either in the Q&A portal or in the chat. And on behalf of MACFEST, I'd like to thank you all for your donations because they help us very much to organize all these events for you. Most of them are free, so please do join us in the future. All of them are listed on Eventbrite. And follow MACFEST and Muslim Women's Arts Foundation on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. And do use our hashtag #SpreadHoney.Hate. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here today, and what a fascinating talk we have this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Daniel Newman. Hello, Daniel. So lovely to have you here. So Daniel holds the chair of Arabic Studies at the University of Durham in the UK. His research and publications have centred on Arabic, geographical and travel literature, 19th century reform movements in Egypt and Tunisia, and medieval Arab culinary history. In 2009, he was the co-recipient of the World Award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies for his book entitled Muslim Women in Law and Society. His research interests also include translation studies and medieval Islamic medicine. Daniel is the co-author of the best-selling An Imam in Paris, an account of a stay in France by Egyptian cleric in 1826 to 1831. His latest book is entitled The Sultan's Feast, a 15th century cookbook, which was longlisted for the Peter Mackenzie Smith Book Prize in 2021 and winner of the Gourmand World Cookbook Award also in 2021. Daniel sits on the editorial board of Food and History and on the scientific committee of the European Institute for the History and Culture of Food, as well as being a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and vice president of the British Association of Teachers of Arabic. Daniel has appeared in a 6-part series on the history of medieval Arab food, broadcast by Al Jazeera over the past week. And we will put, he also runs a blog, and we'll put that link into either the Q&A or the chat, so you can look at that as well and connect to Daniel's blog. He's also on Instagram, just to say, medieval _Arab cooking, where he shares his passion for bringing medieval Arab dishes to life by recreating recipes. And Daniel, my mouth is already watering. So I am now going to pass over to you, and Daniel's going to share with us his presentation. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Karen. Let me just share my screen. I hope this is visible to everybody. First of all, indeed, it's a very propitious time. We've reached the end of Lent, and of course it is still Ramadan, so Ramadan Mubarak to everybody, and also happy Easter Sunday. We're going to take a trip down the history of food, more particularly Arab food. And if I can... Okay, here we go. And my apologies for those who have not yet broken their fast. We've got here a number of pictures of sweets that are usually associated with Ramadan. I can't see you, so I can't see any reaction, but I suspect that many of you will recognize them. We have at the very top, of course, qataif. Then in the middle, we have ma'moul, the date-filled bits. And then at the bottom, we have zulabiya, which of course is known outside the Near East as well, more particularly in East Asia. Now, the next slide actually takes you to the medieval equivalents. And so we have the qataif again, and I've put them in exactly the same order, from the 13th century, filled with an almond paste, also fried and drenched in rosewater syrup. Then in the middle, we have what we can call the ancestor of the ma'moul, which is a date-filled biscuit. This one comes from Egypt and was known then simply as ka'g bil ajwa, so a biscuit filled with dates, date paste rather, which is usually, although it's enjoyed throughout the year, but it's especially associated with the feast celebration, the end of Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr. Hence, they're also known in Egypt, at least, as ka'g al-Eid. So this is the ancestor of the ma'moul that I showed earlier, and also the ultimate ancestor of the fig roll that we have in Britain and the US. Now we're going to take a look at a number of topics, and I've put them here. So we're going to very briefly, my idea today is to give you an overview, to give you a taste, pun intended, of medieval Arab cuisine. And we're going to look at a number of aspects and discuss what I believe to be the most prominent features. So we go to the kitchen, the cooks, the market, the recipes, ingredients, the dining experience, and then we move on to a very, very brief discussion of the link between food and medicine and food and religion. Now, the Arabic culinary tradition is a very, very old one, a very rich one. In fact, it is historically the richest in the world. Before the Arabic cookery books were written. There was only one cookery book, and that dates back to Roman times, 4th century, as the book by Apicius. And then we, before that, have a few recipes dating back to ancient Mesopotamia, about 35 in total. But that really is about it in terms of recipe collections. And for a number of centuries, the only cookery books that were written in Arabic. Before cookery books were being written in Europe. And as you can see here, it spans half a millennium, in fact, even more than half a millennium, from 9th to 15th centuries. It's the best documented cuisine in terms of the sheer number that have survived. So a total of 10. Now, the oldest has been situated in the 10th century, may even reflect a cuisine that goes back to 9th, but it's worth pointing out that the oldest manuscript of that text actually dates from the 13th century. Then we have 5 in the what we can call the golden age of medieval Arab cookery books. That's the 13th century. Then we've got 1 in the 14th and 2 in the 15th centuries. I was also fortunate in that in the course of my research, I was able to identify an additional cookery book, because up until recently, only 9 were considered to be cookery books, which may actually go back to that very early period. Now, the number of recipes in these books varies between, the lowest number is 55, that's one from Syria in the 15th century, to over 800, and that's an Egyptian collection. 2 of them are around, well, actually over the 600 mark, and another couple, the remaining, well over 400. So this is more than 4,200 recipes if we tabulate all of them from the cookery books, but I added here 5,000 plus because there are recipes actually in other resources, such as dietetic manuals, medical manuals, pharmacological treatises, and so the total number is actually very difficult to determine. But as you can imagine, this is an absolutely astounding figure. What's also important to note is that we have these cookery books from across the Muslim world, the medieval Muslim world. So they go from what today is Iraq and Syria, through Egypt, and then the Maghreb, so North Africa, Tunisia in particular, and of course Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus. Now, the authors of these books are generally unknown, and in fact one may well doubt the choice of word of author, because a compiler would probably be a better way of looking at how these books were put together. You have scholars that wrote these books, compiled them. Many of them probably were just amateur cooks rather than professional chefs. And the reason that we have, because we actually know of almost 50 other books that are mentioned, but that have not survived. And of course, one can imagine that because they're cookery books, just like today, you have a recipe collection, you put it in the kitchen. This is not an ideal environment to preserve anything that's written on paper. So that may explain why so many of them have not come down to us. The origins of the culinary tradition, that's another tricky subject, because we are flying completely blind. There's no textual resources really to help us. The link with the Roman collection is a very feeble one, to be honest. Other than that, we have some dishes that go back to ancient Mesopotamia. You remember I mentioned the recipes that have survived, these 30-odd recipes. But probably the single biggest influence comes from Persia, Sassanid Persia. And in terms of the flavors, in terms of the recipes, many of the early recipes, for instance, and ones that continue to be cooked throughout the ages, have Persian names. And so they must have been adopted, like so many things, by the Arabs from the Persians. Unfortunately, we don't have any recipes at all from Sassanid Persia. And so it's impossible to tell how many of these recipes can be traced back to Persia. The earliest Persian cookery books we have are actually from a couple of centuries later. We're talking the 15th century. And so, of course, the cuisine would have changed and possibly would also have undergone influences from Arab cuisine. So it's very difficult to disentangle that. Here we have a map just to perhaps visualize these areas that I talked about. So you can see here Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and this map, incidentally, is one that represents more or less the situation during the Abbasid Caliphate. And now it's time to move on to the kitchen and how were these dishes prepared. Now, the issue of the kitchen is already a thorny subject, because if we talk about the kitchen as a separate space for preparing and cooking food, that's very difficult to actually link to every single of these areas that we've talked about. It is almost certain that most people didn't have a separate space. So the average person. The courts, the palaces, of course, they had multiple kitchens, but they can hardly be seen as the rule. Incidentally, it's also worth pointing out with regard to the cookery books that most of them, of course, reflect an elite cuisine. And so any statements, any conclusions that we draw, any interpretations that we arrive at, they are necessarily viewed through that prism. And so we don't, in the cookery books, generally have a lot of information how the common folk ate. There are some that give us an interesting insight, but only very briefly and fleetingly. Now, in urban environments across the Muslim world, the houses of the nobility, in some regions at least, would also have a kitchen or maybe two. One of them would definitely have an oven or a brazier or a stove, a mustawqad, which is described in one of the cookery books as being trapezoid and the height of about half a grown man. Now, of course, you can imagine these would have produced a lot of smoke. And so the only way you could use those indoors is if you had ventilation. And ventilation would only have been accessible, of course, to people of the higher classes. Further down the social hierarchy, the middle classes, I hesitate to use that word because it is, of course, an anachronism fraught with uncertainty. There was no separate space of this kind. They may have had a separate area for preparing food and, for instance, kneading the dough that would then be sent to the public oven. If we go further down the hierarchy, then we would not have had any space allocated really for food. It's also worth pointing out that archaeological research has found that very few of the houses actually had hearths. So this idea that there would be a chimney and so on isn't really borne out. And again, I stress that we're talking about the urban populations. In the countryside, things would have been slightly different. In Ottoman Cairo, there's evidence going back to the 17th century, so we're now a couple of centuries later, of course. The houses of the nobility almost always had two kitchens. They had one for the cooking, so with the stove and the oven, and then they had another space, usually on another floor, which was used in order to prepare the food. So the second one wouldn't have any ventilation. The first, the real kitchen, of course, would. Now, I mentioned the communal oven. So that was a brick oven. Think of a kind of a traditional baker's oven. A fire would be lit inside, and they had very ingenious ways of modulating heat. Of course, they couldn't just turn the knob like we can today, but they would actually place dishes at a particular distance from the fire, thus being able to put up the heat, so to speak, or to lower it if they needed to simmer the dishes down. And then, of course, there was the tanur. The tanur, most people today refer to it as the tandoor, and most people, I think, know it. The tanur was another oven, goes back to ancient times. It was used in ancient Egypt, and it was also used in ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, the word tanur goes back to an Akkadian, Assyrian word, tinuru. However, it is possible that it predates even the Assyrians, and that they themselves borrowed it from somewhere else. So it's a very old way, a very old oven. So this is a clay oven. They could be built in the ground or above ground. Some of them could be quite big, going up to maybe 6.5 feet. And so a fire is lit at the bottom. When the oven is hot enough, then, of course, loaves of bread, which would have been slightly moistened, would be stuck to the insides very, very quickly, and then for baking. Usually, of course, unleavened bread, although there are some cases where there's a reference to a tanur being called for a leavened bread. This is in the countryside, this would have been much more common. So many houses would have it next to them, but they would use a tanur in common. In urban environments, of course, the tanur really needs to, you need to get rid of the smoke, you need fresh air to come in. So that's not something that anybody would have had inside their homes. But the tanur, instead of just for bread, it was also used, interestingly enough, for roasting, for instance. One popular dish was so-called judarba, which is a dripping pudding. We'll get back to that in a couple of minutes, where a chicken is suspended above loaves of bread, which are layered with fruit. And so the basting juices completely suffuse that pudding. It becomes a pudding. And casseroles would be put in there. Sometimes it would be put in there, they would be put in there overnight, so as to allow for a gentle simmer. And spectacularly, it would also be used to put in whole animals. They would be skewered from back to front and put into the tanur for roasting. The brick oven, the sort of commercial oven, that was used by a lot of people because, as I mentioned earlier, so they would make the dough, prepare the dough at home, and then take it to the oven, although you could also buy a bread there, but that was frowned upon. And even in some cases, prepare dishes. And of course, this is something that we still see in certain regions today, where the dough is made at home, but is then sent to the public oven, the bakery. In addition, there was also a huge arsenal, a very highly sophisticated arsenal of kitchenware, with, of course, mortars and pestles, rotating spits, special kneading tubs, grills, marble slabs to make confection, special molds and griddles to make kunafa, special pans to make qataif. They had special implements, for instance, special hooks in order to manipulate the food as it was frying away. And sometimes things were heated up in a pit called a malla, with hot ashes and stones. And for instance, you can use that for bread. Naturally, once again, these are all the implements that are mentioned in cookery books, which, as I've said, reflect this elite cuisine, and the average person would not have had access to this kind of arsenal. The biggest resource, though, by far, was human. It was the manpower, or should I say woman power. And if we were to say, go back in time and enter one of the palatial kitchens, say, of the great Harun al-Rashid, it would be a hive of activity with a multitude of people working away, many of them enslaved, of course. And they would be, in fact, we have some indications that already in medieval Arab cuisine, we have, in a way, a precursor to the so-called modular way of cooking that's associated with French cuisine. By that, of course, is meant that various things are prepared in advance in order to be used. Now, if you think about it, when you don't have blenders and processors, you need, of course, to prepare things in advance. So you would have the pomegranate seeds. There would be the special sauce that they used, which is an equivalent to our soy sauce, which is called murri, which could take several months to prepare. They would, of course, have animals that needed to be slaughtered. So the kitchens would also have stables so that animals would be slaughtered shortly before they were cooked. And here, for instance, you see a couple of examples. So on the left, you have a scene where people are cooking outside, and you see those, they're cooking something on a pot that would be like on a portable stove that they had. And in the center, here you have the section, this is an Ottoman kitchen actually, the section where the animals would be prepared for cooking. And then on the right, you have the slaughtering of a camel. And as you can see there's a gentleman who is kindling the fire by blowing on it. And so again, the portable stove. So they had the stove at home, but they also had a portable version and also a brazier, of course, that was used for cooking when they were traveling, for instance. And some of the rulers would travel with a huge kitchen retinue. This is not, think a picnic, but times a million, with a separate caravan almost to carry all the pots and pans and all the provisions. And here I've got, if everybody can see it, I've got a little movie of the tanur and a lamb that's being roasted in it. As you can see, this is one that's dug in the ground. And there we go. It comes out nicely roasted and golden and ready for serving. And then on the left, we have an interesting contraption. And I'm thinking that some of you may recognize this. This is actually one of the oldest couscousières. So a pot to make couscous. So you have the couscous pot, and of course, then you have the top one, excuse me, which sits snugly on the lower one. And as you can see, there really is a little or no difference from the couscous pots that are being used still today. This one, incidentally, is from 13th century Al-Andalus. Now it's time to move on to the cooks. So the cooks. Cooking was serious business, and a cook was a craftsman, an artisan, and one who was often held in high esteem. And the cookery books, several of them, devote quite a bit of attention to what they believed cooks should have to do and the standards that cooks needed to meet. And so in one Mamluk cookery book, for instance, the following requirements are set out. Some of the requirements, I'll read some of them out. One is to avoid contact with dirt, because that will turn people away from your food. Take care of your personal hygiene. Have an intelligent disposition, pared nails, and clean clothes, since these are attractive to people. Know that the best cooking pots to choose are those made out of soapstone, followed by earthenware. Copper containers are bad and must be tinned. Choose wood that is dry and does not produce visible smoke because it's damp. And if you cook with it one day and it doesn't smoke, continue using it. I have cooked, this is the author speaking, I've cooked with dried date palm and found its smoke to be highly fragrant. He goes on to talk about the best kinds of vegetables and spices, and that the chef should find out which are the freshest, and also that the spices should be thoroughly cleaned, and one should only grind what one will use so as not to dilute the strength of the spice. Now, these are very familiar recommendations to us, because as we all know now, spices indeed, they are the most fragrant, the most pungent, when of course they are freshly prepared rather than bought, because then they can easily dry out. Cooking was such serious business that it was also something that caliphs, scholars, doctors, you name it, were very much interested in. And several of these categories, in fact, produced cookery books. The half-brother of Harun al-Rashid, the short-lived caliph himself, Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi, for instance, was a famous gourmet. And he, in addition to writing his cookery book, his own cookery book, he's also credited with having invented several dishes. Now, I've tended to use the male masculine pronoun, but there were also a fair number of women involved in the kitchen. And these we find even at the highest level. We have, for instance, Buran, the wife of the Caliph al-Ma'mun, the son of Harun al-Rashid, who created an aubergine dish that subsequently became known by her name, the Buraniya. Generally, though, very few of the chefs are known to us by name, and I guess this is the fate of most artisans in history. One of the cookery books, the oldest, does mention a couple of courtly chefs. One in particular is worth a mention, Abu Samid, so the fat one, who appears to have been the private chef to the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq. Now, there was also a famous poet by the name of Kushejim, who was also said to be an extremely famous and adept chef. Other women that are mentioned in the cookery books, though, are servant girls, maidservants. The most famous of these is somebody called Bidha, who was somebody who cooked for the aforementioned gourmet Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi. And there are also references dotted about the cookery books where people refer to, I learned this from the servant girls working in such and such a palace. But unfortunately, their names are generally unknown to us. Now we move on to the market. And the market, the souk, was a center, of course, of commercial activity in every town. And here we have a medieval illustration of the souk. It was a place where, of course, food and also medicines were sold. Because one of the things that I haven't mentioned, and that perhaps would have caused you to wonder, is if people didn't have kitchens, how did they get their food? They just ate bread? No, of course not. Most people, so the average person, would eat out. And eating out meant eating out at the souk. And so street food, what we call street food now, was very much a big thing. Even these elusive middle classes would also have recourse to the market for some of their food, at least, because even those that were better off, there were still certain things, and the cookery books actually allude to that. They were still things that they would buy at market. For instance, rose water. People would not distill that at home, unless, of course, you were the caliph and you would have your own distillery. But most people would just buy that. There's also references, for instance, to a certain type of noodle, that a dried noodle that was also purchased from market. Now, the Arabic word souk refers both to the exchange of goods and services and the place where these exchanges take place. Now, we are fortunately very well informed about what went on at these markets, because there's a particular genre of books known as Hizba manuals, which were written for the market inspector. He was known as the Muhtasib. And this was an official. It was already set up in the days of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was usually known back then in the early days as Amil al-Suq or Sahib al-Suq, so the lord of the market, if you will. And the purpose of the market inspector was to monitor moral behavior in general, but this also extended to immoral behavior to do with food and the preparation thereof. Food and also medicines, because medicines were also sold at market, usually by somebody called Sharabi, selling medicinal syrup. So it's very much a kind of fair trading standards officer, but as we shall see, with a few more powers than his contemporary counterpart. He was a market policeman. And so what do these manuals tell us? And we have them from various parts of the Muslim world. We have them from the Near East, but also from Al-Andalus. And so we find, for instance, that at market, we could buy, supposing we were walking around the market just to whet our appetites. So you could get some zulabiya, which we've seen. You could, of course, get some fresh meat. Then you could buy roast meat. There was a separate stand for sheep's heads, for those who were partial to that particular delicacy. And then, of course, there were fish fryers. There were the harissa makers, harissa, a meat porridge that was very, very popular in the day. Those who made all kinds of sausages. Bakers, of course, clarified butter, semen makers, and another very popular one was, of course, the confectioners selling all kinds of sweetmeats. Now, these texts also inform us about the fraudulent practices that went on, particularly by specifying how the market inspector could detect them. And some of the fraud, it just shows us once again how things don't really change over history. Some of the things that the the more unscrupulous market traders would engage in is, for instance, that meat porridge, harissa. They would, of course, reduce the amount of meat. The fried donuts, they would use subpar flour, or sometimes they would even mix it with sawdust. And of course, the temptation and crime rate rose with the preciousness of the ingredients. Saffron, for instance, again, a popular one these days, people who travel and they buy saffron at cut prices and think that they've got the real thing. Saffron was also adulterated in very inventive and ingenious ways. An interesting one here is that they would adulterate saffron with chicken breasts and beef, which would be boiled in water and then shredded, and then mixed with the saffron in order to give it the right color. And then, of course, that would be mixed in the baskets and sold to the unsuspecting customer at the usual high rate. In camphor, which was also used in food, camphor, far more seriously, they would, some of them would manufacture it with waste marble that they got from the marble trimmers. Others would dilute it with resin and then simply sifted in with the camphor. Musk, of course, the most precious of aromatic ingredients, came all the way from Tibet. And this is what the market inspector had to say about it. The way to identify, and he lists a number of ways that the unscrupulous market traders corrupt this, but he said the way to identify these and all other kinds of adulteration of the varieties of musk is to put a little of it in your mouth, spit it out onto a piece of white cloth and shake it off. If it can be shaken off and does not stain, then it's not adulterated with dye or anything else. But if it cannot be shaken off and stains, then of course it's adulterated. Now, I said the market inspector, the medieval market inspector, had a few things up his sleeve that his contemporary counterpart doesn't have, and that is enforcement. Monitoring without enforcement, of course, does not lead to a change in behavior. And the market inspectors, it has to be said, took this aspect of their task extremely seriously. The Muhtaseb was, in fact, in the Hizbah manuals, enjoined to intimidate those he even suspected of committing crimes. And for that reason, what he would have a whip, which would be displayed. So the market inspector, incidentally, would also have a stall, his office, if you will, and the whip would be hanging there as a sign of things to come for anybody tempted to defraud his customers. And so there would be regular floggings. Also, they would have a cap, that a dunce's cap, that they would force anybody who committed a fraud to wear, so that everybody, and he would be paraded through. There would be pillaring of the culprits, so as to serve as an example, of course, to others who might think about swindling their customers. They were particularly rough on those selling the pharmacists, of course, selling the medicines, because they, of course, could inflict very serious damage. Incidentally, the Muhtasib started off as a kind of moral policeman, and that also continued through the ages. And so they would also be very mindful of, for instance, the mixing of the sexes. And if somebody was caught with adultery, that, of course, it would also fall upon the market inspector to mete out the required punishment, which, of course, would be stoning in a number of cases. So this is more or less the picture of the market that one would expect to find in medieval times. And then we go on to the recipes themselves. Now, the recipes in the collections really run the entire gamut of everything to do with eating and dining. And so the cookery books contain savory recipes, various types of sweets, also dairy, so various types of yogurts, condiments and pickles. They were very, very keen picklers. The reason for that is that it was a very sustainable cuisine. Nothing was wasted. And so anything that wasn't eaten then and there would be stored. And of course, in many cases, it would need to be pickled, or it would need to be cured or dried. So this applied to vegetables, of course. Turnips were a particular favorite for the pickling, but also meat. Meat would be dried, what we today call jerky, which in Arabic is known as hadid, which already existed actually in pre-Islamic times. The cookery collections also include recipes for hand-washing powders and even for perfumes, for reasons that will become clear in a minute. And here we have some of the recipes that I've recreated. So we have top left-hand corner, that is the judaba, so with the chicken roasting on a spit over this pudding. And then we have underneath the rumaniya, which is a pomegranate stew. There's a similar dish still, of course, in Persian cuisine. In Arab cuisine, at least in some areas, there is also a rumaniya, but not made with meat. And then the top right-hand corner, we have one of the most famous dishes of medieval times, the sigbaj. The sigbaj, this is one of those, in fact, the judaba as well, both of these come no doubt from Persia because of the name. Sigbaj, of course, translates literally as vinegar stew, and it is a vinegar stew with multiple meats. It is unfortunate that these two highly popular dishes, recipes for which could be found in so many cookery books, that these have not survived. And that, in fact, is one of the differences, although I started out by showing you a very clear link with the past, with our Taif and Ma'mul. One of the striking things is that there were so many dishes that haven't survived, and most of them, they were particularly partial to stews. And of course, today there are still stews. There's the yakhne of modern times. There's the maraga in North Africa, but the sheer number of stews, and also the fact that so many of them were fruit stews with all manner of fruit, apple, quince, pomegranate, sour oranges, naranj, and so on and so forth. It's quite unfortunate that these, on the whole, have not survived. The illustration in the bottom right-hand corner, incidentally, that refers to the making of another very famous dish, a food item, known as, back then, as the sambusaj or the sambusak, which today, of course, we know as the samosa, which also goes back to medieval Arab cuisine, although the origins of that particular food are probably in Asia, in China. Let's turn now to the ingredients. What kinds of flavors would we have encountered? Well, remember, it's an elite cuisine, so we have a very meat-heavy diet for prestige reasons, in part, and so it really was a meat feast. There was no less is more is less. No, more was just more. And so that sigbaj, for instance, could be made with, well, practically any kind of meat that they had lying around or could get their hands on. And there are some amazing examples where one wonders whether they really did have pots large enough to put all that meat in. It was a carnivore's dream. Now, usually the meat was lamb, as it still is today. Lamb was king, and of course, this is also linked to the religious significance of lamb, because it's eaten at religious festivals and so on. We saw that picture of the camel, and I showed it on purpose because it's one of those things that people assume that they were eating camels. Actually, no, camel is not mentioned very often at all. It's very rare. And this goes back, of course, to the pre-Islamic times. You know, if you're a Bedouin and you need your camels, you're not going to slaughter camels unless you have to, or unless, of course, you are inviting people, in which case you might do it as a sign of hospitality. The other thing is the chicken. That was probably number two. Beef was eaten very rarely, if at all, in the Near East, but is associated mainly with Andalusian cuisine. Pigeon was also consumed, but that really is about it. Other meats are mentioned, interestingly enough, mostly from the Western Mediterranean. And the Western Mediterranean, we have things like deer, donkey, mountain goat, gazelle, hedgehog, that's a really disturbing one for me, goose, and also the oldest rabbit and hare recipes in Arab cuisine. Fish wasn't rated very highly. Once again, that's associated more with the Western Mediterranean. In the Near East, really, meat was king. Vegetables were eaten in the stews, and of course we already have mulukhia, another one that we still have today. Aubergine was also used. Onions were very, very popular. Celery, chard, lentils, and quite a few beans. Broad beans, mung beans were called for in a number of recipes. Vegetables, that's a tricky one. So I said that meat was associated with the prestige element of the kitchen, but there was another reason, and that is that medically vegetables were frowned upon by many of the physicians. And so vegetables were generally not eaten uncooked. In fact, if we go by one very famous physician, a Samarkandi, who said, the body receives very little nourishment from vegetables, buqul. And what it does receive is watery and of little use. When eaten uncooked, they are almost impossible to digest. Now, of course, there is some truth in that vegetables that are uncooked are indeed, as we now know, are much more difficult to digest than cooked vegetables. Bread was very, very popular. And here's an interesting contrast between the early European cookery books and the Arab ones. The early European cookery books have no recipes at all for bread, whereas the Arab cookery books, many of them actually, that's their first chapter, which tells you something about the importance that they attached to bread. Fruit, they enjoyed fruit, again used often in stews. Nuts as well, pistachios, almonds, walnuts, they occur in many dishes. And if you've noticed in my list of dishes, there's quite a sweet and sour element. They were very, very popular. Sweet and sour, the sour often being the vinegar. And so that's a bit of an acquired taste. In terms of fruit, it was recommended that they should be eaten before the meal, unless it involves fruit that are slow to digest. Examples being, for instance, quince, apple, or pomegranate. But once again, the doctor's advice was to avoid fresh fruits altogether, a bit like vegetables. Spices. Well, the spices, they loved spices. It's an extremely aromatic cuisine. And among the main spices, cumin, coriander, ginger, cinnamon, saffron, pepper, salt, but also very unusual ones, at least for us today. Asafoetida, spikenard, musk, and of course ambergris. The use of sweeteners is quite interesting. So their main sweeteners were sugar and honey. And here we have another dichotomy between the East and the West. Sugar was very expensive. And so it's little surprise that on the elite's tables, sugar would be more highly prized than honey, which would be the poor man's sweetener, so to speak. This was also driven by physicians, the royal physicians, who were also pushing sugar as a medicine. In the Western Mediterranean, however, the situation was slightly different. There we have the reverse. There are many more recipes that require honey than sugar. And here's because there was a pushback from Andalusian physicians who claimed that one should only use honey because the use of sugar that's pushed by these foreign physicians, in fact, runs counter the Galenic theory of medicine, about which more in a second. Now, there was an intense movement of trade in various foodstuffs. Of course, spices. The Arab traders for many centuries had the monopoly on spice trade. We have, for instance, a 9th century account known as Akhbar as-Sin wal Hind, so news of China and India. This lists actually very helpfully the kinds of things that were traded. So here are mentioned various kinds of fruits, apples, peaches, citrons, pomegranate, and so on and so forth, but also pistachios, plums, and of course, sugarcane, bananas, and many of the spices, most of which, of course, have their origin in Asia, which is why they were so expensive and precious. Because of the Arab trade or the Arab merchants, many of the vegetables and spices were introduced into Europe through them. And the list is quite extraordinary, but I'll just give you a couple just to get an idea. So the Arabs introduced a banana. Yes, bananas were grown in Al-Andalus in North Africa. Sour orange, not the sweet orange. So sour orange being naranj, sweet orange being burtuqal, which of course has a link with Portugal. Sugarcane, apricots, artichoke, rice, saffron, aubergine, parsnip, lemon, lime, carrot, and I could go on a bit longer, but I shan't, all introduced into Christian Europe through the Arab merchants, mainly through, of course, Al-Andalus, but also through another route that went through Italy. And of course, I'm sure you know that Sicily, of course, had an Arab history. But then as now, it's not because people speak the same language and share the same religion that they have exactly the same diet. In fact, there are considerable differences between populations within one and the same country. And of course, the Middle Ages were no exception. I've already mentioned a couple of differences between the Mashriq, the East, and the West, the Maghrib. But here are a few others. So in the Near East, and I've been recreating dishes now for almost 10 years, and the differences are such that the Western and Eastern palates were quite distinct. And I think that one can easily pass a kind of blind test, at least for certain dishes. So in the Near East, for instance, we're talking about cooking oils and fats. They used a lot of sheep's tail fat. The meat I've already mentioned, predominantly lamb, and the fruit stews. So those are kind of, and vinegar, of course, mustn't forget vinegar. Those are the kind of main flavors that one would have expected in the Near East. In the Maghreb and Al-Andalus, on the other hand, there it's the amount of dairy that's used. Andalusians really love dairy. They use eggs in almost every single dish. They have several yogurts. They also, one of the cookery books has a recipe for snails, which of course are still very popular as a street food in Morocco today. The use of fresh fish and also dried fish. It's only in the Western Mediterranean cookery books that we find recipes for tuna, the only ones in the entire collection. Rabbit and hare, only in the West. Although hare was eaten in the East, it doesn't appear in the cookery books. And rabbits, of course, were not available in the East. So that's a moot point. Aubergine was eaten a lot in both parts of the Mediterranean. And as I mentioned, beef was used more in Al-Andalus than in the Near East. But in terms of oils, the biggest difference, of course, is olive oil. So sheep's tail fat is hardly used. And olives were king, and so olive oil was used in everything. They also had their own peculiar garnish. So before serving a dish, they would dust it with a variety of spices that one wouldn't necessarily find in the Near East. So they would sprinkle on spikenard, ginger, pepper which could even be sprinkled on sweet dishes. And the cooking methods are also quite interesting in that the Western Mediterranean cookery books reveal much more of variety and complexity of cooking with different stages where the Near East would only use one or two. It was a very healthy cuisine because it was dictated by the seasons. And as I've said, nothing went to waste. And here we have a picture of some of those frequently used spices. We have coriander at the bottom, and then top right we have ginger, and top left we have one that I haven't on purpose mentioned yet, and that's sumac. Sumac, a much underestimated herb, and this was extremely popular in the Near East. In fact, it is said that the Caliph Harun al-Rashid would eat a sumac stew, sumaqiya, almost every day. In the Western Mediterranean, sumac is hardly ever used. In fact, I think there's only one recipe in one of the books that calls for sumac, and then possibly just as an alternative, and possibly because it's a recipe that might have originated in the East, but it was not part of the Andalusian diet. The dining experience, and that's another interesting point. It was very much a holistic experience that really appealed to all of the senses, including the visual. And it's very important because it's a communal act. And everything was marshaled to ensure the most enhanced experience. And that included coloring foods, the use of elegant and precious tableware, a spectacular presentation, and the involvement of diners, for instance, in some cases, through cooking birds at the table in a specially made glass container. People ate with their fingers, requiring, of course, thorough cleansing of the hands both before and after the meal. Spoons and knives were used, but regarded a bit more sophisticated. There were no forks. Napkins were often scented and used to cover the clothes of the diners. There are examples in the literature of diners using multiple spoons. There's one example of a prince from Iraq who apparently got through as many as 30 spoons in one sitting, with 2 servants, no less, being charged with the swapping of the spoons. people would be sitting on the floor, and there would be the table would be a cover which could be made out of fabric or leather, or even leaves. And there were often low tables, so a round table that was raised could be on legs, or anything else that would raise it, known as the khiwan. The cover was known as the sufra. There were no chairs and, of course, no high tables. Now, the Arabic word ma'ida, which in modern standard Arabic is just a word for table, generally denoted both. So both the cover on the floor and the raised table. Though technically and lexicologically, there was another distinction between ma'ida and this table, the khiwan. In that the khiwan is the word to use when the raised table is empty, and ma'ida when the table is full of food, which is, I think, a very interesting way. So you don't, if somebody calls you to dinner and you say, oh, I can see the khiwan, then you can wait until they tell you the ma'ida is there, which would indicate, of course, that the food is on the table. The word sufra in modern Arabic still survives in that sense. You know, in Egypt, for instance, when you've been invited to somebody's house and you had a nice meal, at the end of it, you say sufra daima. You know, may your table be always laden with food to express your thanks for the meal. And in Egypt, of course, also the word for a waiter is the sufragi. Now, let us imagine we are the fortunate guests of a member of the nobility in, say, the 10th century. So we enter, and we would be perfumed. There would be some hand washes, which would also be very delicate and composed of the most precious ingredients. We would first be served some idam. And idam, in fact, technically means anything that's served with bread. In practice, we're talking about dips, like vinegar or olive oil, fermented condiments. And almost at the same time, we would get some cold dishes, known in Arabic as bawarid. And these cold dishes, that could be meat, it could be vegetable, could also be fish. And then we would move on to the hot dishes. As you will have noticed, the table would be extremely crowded with all of these dishes. So the idea of courses didn't really exist. So the hot dishes, you would have stews, you would have samosas, sausages, kebabs, all of them, of course, with their own delicate sauces and wonderful garnishes. Our bellies would be full by now. And now it's time for the sweets. And what sweets will we have? Well, we could look forward to the khabis, the pudding, the faludaj, starch pudding. We could have qatayef, which we've already discussed, zulabiya, and so on and so forth. There would be little drinking at the table of anything, because it was felt that drinking during a meal was harmful to one's health. So there would be water, but it would be left until the end of the meal, when people would also drink sweetened and fruity drinks, which were thought to assist digestion. Naturally, when talking about dining in the Muslim Middle Ages, one is invariably drawn to the Arabian Nights-style banquets that are made popular in Hollywood movies. But this is actually a case where the Hollywood movies underplay some of the opulence and excess that actually happened, albeit very rarely. The banquets held by caliphs and the such may have been bywords for luxury, but they should also be viewed as acts of hospitality, which was one of the most important virtues in Bedouin society, which was continued into Islam. In addition, there was also a religious dimension, which we'll get to in a second. The most famous example is, of course, the wedding of the already mentioned El Ma'mun with the also already mentioned Buran. We don't incidentally know whether she cooked her aubergine dish for her husband. And so this is how the great historian Ibn Khaldun describes it. 140 mule loads of wood had been brought 3 times a day for a whole year to the kitchen and were ready for the wedding night. All that wood was consumed that very night. Boatmen were ordered to bring boats to transport the distinguished guests on the Tigris from Baghdad to the royal palaces in the city where the wedding took place. And the boats prepared for that purpose numbered 30,000 and carried people back and forth all day. If we were lucky enough to be invited to that, we might also have been lucky enough to have received very precious gifts, because the guests were given melons made of amber, and in the middle of these melons, there would be the name of an estate. And so this was your gift by Al-Ma'mun for being at the wedding. His father-in-law had prepared a mat woven of gold with 1,000 of the largest pearls being showered on the groom and bride. It's said that it cost 50 million dirhams and is by far, if that is true, by far the most expensive banquet ever in history, possibly even more expensive than those that the Assyrians used to hold. However, this tradition can be found somewhere else, and the historical chronicles are full of these wonderful statistics of the number of cows that were slaughtered, lamb, chickens, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But as we shall see, the religious element was another important point. But before we get on to that, part of the dining experience, and if we were lucky enough to be invited by one of these dignitaries, we would have to be careful and behave properly, because etiquette was considered to be extremely important, and inappropriate behavior was reprimanded and one could be asked to leave, or worse, if such bad behavior was conducted in front of one of the high and mighty. There was a genre of literature even that emerged that dealt specifically with etiquette. And they're very funny texts, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. They offer a taxonomy of bad behavior. And so, for instance, we have the stretcher, al-maddad, a person who perhaps bites on a stringy piece of meat not quite cooked, drawing it out with his teeth while his hand pulls it away from him. It sometimes happens that he breaks it by a violent tug, and it will be splattered over the clothes of a person sitting alongside him. Or the thruster, dafa, a person who, when a bone happens to be in the large bowl and turns out to be in part of what is next to him, will push it aside with a piece of bread until a piece of meat comes in its place. All the time, of course, it appears as if he's trying to sup up the broth with his bread rather than trying to steal the meat. And finally, the shifter, the most dastardly of such individuals, al-muhawwil. The shifter is a person who, when he sees a lot of date stones before him, he contrives to mix them with his unsuspecting neighbor's date stones, making it appear that his neighbor had committed the incredible sin of gluttony. Now, food was also linked to medicine. Whoops. No, I'm sorry here. Those of you who didn't remember the earlier slides, food and medicine. I do apologize. There seems to be an issue
take
here.
your time, Daniel.
I can already talk about food and medicine. I've got a quote here from the great Razi, which says, "Don't treat with medicines something you can treat with food." And here we have the quote. He was known as Rhazes in the Latin tradition. And what is significant here is that this is part of a system of medicine that goes back to the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, which was, of course, perfected by the Muslim physicians. Now, we're not going to go into this. Suffice it to say that it's a system based on achieving balance within the body. Balance equals health. Imbalance means illness. Now, the way in which either one is achieved is, in fact, through eating food. And in fact, the cookery books often contain recipes that refer to the medicinal properties of ingredients or even recipes. So it will be said, for instance, well, this particular recipe is good for those with cold humors, for instance. And food, in fact, can be subdivided in a number of categories. On the one hand, we have food that's only food, and then we have food that can also be medicine, and then we have medicine that is only medicine. But even the last category is, in fact, not as cut and dried as it seems, because taste was extremely important. And physicians believed that in order for a patient to get better through the treatment of eating certain foods or certain concoctions, the food and the medicine had to taste nice. And so the medicine often was also used for its own sake. You would have, for instance, a very nice drink made with, whatever the doctor prescribed you, but it would always be sweetened, like an oxymel. And so people would enjoy. Today, of course, that's difficult for us to imagine. I don't think anybody here would say, oh, I'm feeling a bit peckish, let me drink some cough syrup. Well, one would, of course, if it was made with some very nice and healthy and fresh ingredients. Now, the medicinal effect, as I've said, wasn't linked just to ingredients, spices, and so on, but also to dishes. And so, for instance, the Zulabiya was said to be very good against moist coughs and moistness of the chest. On the other hand, it generates blockages in the liver. So if you're prone to blockages in the liver, don't eat Zulabiya. And if you have a moist cough, by all means, indulge. Now, this is where the system occasionally breaks down, the framework, because one wonders, of course, what is the link between these illnesses, these ailments, and the purported efficacy of the dishes? Well, in many cases, it's very difficult to imagine there was one. Some physicians did come up with some theories, but they weren't really applied. And for instance, we have a case of medicines that would be useful against a variety of illnesses. In one case, for instance, there's a lemon stomach digestive that can be used for no fewer than 25 ailments, including coughing, impotence, digestive problems, urinary tract problems. In fact, it was literally, I guess, a panacea. The cookery books, as I've said, were to some extent guided by this. And the question then becomes, well, to what extent was people's diets guided by this? Well, one thing to remember is that the diet of society was pretty uniform. There weren't that big, such big differences. The only difference, of course, was in the ingredients used. So, for instance, a sigbaj made for Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi would contain, I don't know how many different types of meats, but in a kind of lower middle class family, it would perhaps be made with only one meat. And so in that sense, the courts, and there are many references to that, the courts, their physicians would the caliph's physicians would monitor their food intake in order to ensure their physical health. And as we know, this kind of trickle-down effect of people trying to copy the nobility, in that sense, it did permeate the diet of people to some extent, of course. And then finally, we have food and religion, which also played a very big part. It played a part, but not surprisingly, in the cookery books. So there are no references really to foods being eaten for particular festivals. And as a result, the impression confirms what I said earlier, in that across society, all classes would have a similar diet, but the same was true for all religious communities, because many of these cookery books were, of course, produced in regions where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived cheek by jowl. And so there was no difference between the religious communities, except, of course, for ritual reasons. And so for their religious festivals, they would each have their own types of foods, but generally speaking, the day-to-day diet did not vary between the religious communities. The role of religion did matter in other respects, in terms of the use of certain ingredients, for instance. And one can imagine that the use of zanjabil, ginger, which I've got here, which is mentioned in the Quran, that would, in addition to its medical properties, would have been a good reason for it to be used in such large quantities. This is supposition on my part, but it seems to me to be quite plausible. What you have in front of you here is an extract from a book on another medical framework, and I will end with that, which is known as prophetic medicine. Now, prophetic medicine, prophetic medicine was a framework that, in fact, took over from the Galenic system, from the Greek system, because it mixed religion and the Galenic system. And so here we have a kind of integrated Islamic Greek system that also provided guidance with regard to the foods that people should eat. And I think I shall leave it here. Thank you very much for making time. And here for more information, the blog and Instagram. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. What a fascinating talk. And I love the idea of communal cooking and communal dining, and how food actually ultimately brings us together, which I think you've shown there in the history there of medieval cooking and recipes. Look, and the food that people were eating at the time, a really fascinating insight. We do have a couple of questions, if that's okay, just before we go. I have one from Ian Fleming saying, where does the 13th century anonymous Andalusian cookery book fit in, or does it?
Yes, well, it's one of two cookery books from the Western Mediterranean. The other one is written by an Andalusian exile in Tunisia by the name of Tujibi. And so the things that I've mentioned about Western cuisine in terms of the differences between the East and West are also very visible in that particular cookery book. So, for instance, the importance of eggs and so on.
Great, thank you. Just going back to the kind of kitchen, I guess, and I have a question from Jeff saying, regarding kind of ventilation, which you talked about around ovens, how did it work, and what prevented less wealthy homes from having it, and was it to do with construction, say, for example?
Well, yes, it had to do with construction. If you're living in cramped conditions, there's no adequate ventilation for cooking, so the the houses of the nobility would be fitted with an adequate ventilation system. So it really was a question of wealth and space, of course, as I mentioned. You needed space in order to have these stoves and ovens and all of the kitchenware that goes with it.
Great. Another question from Amara. I wonder if they have any devices at that time, like refrigerators for preserving leftovers. Was there a fridge in medieval times?
There was no fridge, but there were ice houses. And yes, they had ice and they would import it. So yes, very sophisticated, but ice would not have been available to the average person. But yes, absolutely, they had ice. They knew how to transport it, and so there are references, for instance, to iced drinks and so on. Yeah.
Another one regarding food preparations and things like sauces that might have been made far ahead of time. Again, what do we know about food storage? I know you mentioned things about pickling and curing meats. Was there any sort of other food storage at the time?
Yes, absolutely. So we have, what else do we have? We have those sauces, that fermented sauce that I mentioned, that murri, which is a bit like our soy sauce. Olives would be stored. Various vegetables. That's another thing, of course, that would be stored or people, the nobility, would have room to store all of that. But that would also be, of course, purchased at market, many of those things. But yes, so they had special jars that they used for storage, jars made of earthenware, even leather jars. They also had jars to make various types of milk derivatives, whether they be sour milk, yogurts, cottage cheese. Yes, they had a kind of cottage cheese. Fresh cheese, of course. They had cheese molds. Yes, absolutely.
Great. A question here. Have you used is it the Shahnameh book, the Book of Kings, for your research at all, for any of your cookbooks? For your particular book?
No. What I have used occasionally pictures from illustrated manuscripts of the Shahnameh, but not for the food. In fact, there's only one Persian source really that from Sassanid times that is relevant to food. But it doesn't contain recipes. It simply lists a number of dishes that were eaten. No.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple. I mean, there's some amazing responses on the chat saying how wonderful this talk is and a great insight into the history of Arabic food and so forth. And one other question here is, could you describe the role of men and women in the process of cooking? Was there a difference between the gender?
Yes, that's an excellent question, but I'll try to be very brief. Usually, it's generally assumed that they were all men, but I have over time changed my mind on that considerably. What seems to have been the case is that there were probably in the kitchen as many, if not more, women than men, but the actual cooks that are mentioned tend to be men, as in who had the profession of cook, because the women that I mentioned, they tend to be, I learned this recipe from the slave girls working in the house of so-and-so. There's also evidence, for instance, that in middle-class households, the cooking was actually done by females, again, maid servants. In a 15th century cookery book, there's mention of the author actually saying, well, you know, I asked my servants, my maid servants, to make this dish. So there are these references that one needs to decode. Now, when it comes to, and I guess that's a kind of underlying second question of the first one, in terms of division of labor, that's a question that's impossible to answer. But definitely there was a huge contribution by female maid servants working in the kitchens. Absolutely.
Great. I think to keep to time, Daniel, we should end now, but I think it's an amazing journey through history that you've shared with us today. Thank you, and thanks to all our lovely audience from all over the world, really, who have come to listen today. It's been a most fascinating, amazing talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Karen, for hosting this. Well done. And what can I say, Professor Newman? Not just thank you so much, but it's absolutely an enchanting session. I'm so glad we have hosted you for MACFEST. It's been thoroughly amazing. And of course, we've learned a lot and appreciated a lot. And the audience, as you've seen, not had a chance, will send you the chat later. They have been literally from across the world, from one end, China, Indonesia at one end, Bogota, Colombia at the other end, never mind Europe or Africa. It's been a thoroughly amazing event. I cannot tell you how successful it has been for us, and we're really, really delighted to host you. For those of you asking about YouTube, yes, we have recorded it. And with Professor Newman's permission, we will post it sometime soon, and it's been live streamed at the same time. Now, if you enjoyed that, everybody, then you know what's coming next is our last treat, a feast for the month of Ramadan. Last week, we were in Tunisia to celebrate the art and culture of cuisine. This week, we've been going to the Middle Ages for the amazing feast that Professor Newman has offered you. Next week, we are going to Middle Ages in Spain. So Steve, if you could put the poster for us for next week. So it's with two ladies. They'll be from California, Shadab. And the one iftar with our partner is a live one, and it's booked, and it's in Manchester. So our international audience can't join us for that. For you people, we take you to Spain for more of cuisine and more of poetry with two ladies, Shadab and Yvonne. So inshallah, see you next week at the same time. And again, Professor Newman, that was absolutely brilliant. I cannot tell you how pleased we are and loved it so much. And thank you to our amazing audience from across the world for giving us their time early in the morning in America, in Canada, to midnight in Indonesia. So thank you, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much.
We will be in touch, Karen, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you very much. Hope everything else goes well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for giving us your Sunday, Easter Sunday. Really appreciate it.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.